Everybody, you gotta come back with me. Back to the tiki bar. What is up, YouTube land? It's your host, the Movie Dude. We're here back at the movie tiki bar. And we're gonna talk today about a trilogy of films that I think that everyone needs to see. If they haven't seen it, shame on them. Today we're going to be talking about, you probably guessed it already, Back to the Future. Now, this week we've only got one cocktail to go along with the trilogy, but you can drink a series of them while you're watching all three movies, and by the end of it, you'll swear you've had many different cocktails because you'll be so drunk. That being said, let's get talking about the movies. Or maybe first we should go into the history of the movies. Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis were writing partners for a number of years. They worked on many films together, and one day Bob Gale went to his high school reunion. He found out that his father actually went to the same high school as him. And he thought to himself, you know, if I had known my dad in high school, would I have been friends with my dad? That being said, he came back and pitched the idea to Robert Zemeckis. Zemeckis loved it, and the two of them were off and running. It was the early 80s at that time, around 81, 82. They wrote a draft of the script titled Back to the Future. They took it to every studio in town, including Disney, who turned it down promptly because of the sexual tension between Marty and his mother. What did they know, right? Point is, Back to the Future has become a cult classic now. But the point is, in its earlier drafts, it's not the movie we all know. It was very different. Originally, Doc Brown worked on the Manhattan Project. Another thing is, originally, it was actually a nuclear explosion on a testing ground in New Mexico that made the time machine go back in time. And what was the time machine at that time? A refrigerator. More importantly, Marty was a video pirate. That's right. Originally, Marty McFly, badass guitarist, driver of the DeLorean, and hell of a skateboarder, was a video pirate. Yikes. I'm glad they made the changes they made because I love the Back to the Future trilogy the way they are. But if you never get a hold of a copy of the original screenplay, make sure you read it because those are truly interesting takes on these characters. Anyway, the movies themselves. Let's talk about that. Back to the Future Part 1. Who doesn't love this movie? I still quote it every now and then. There's some great lines in this. Lorraine, I'm your density. I mean, your destiny. Come on. It may be cheesy, and I know my delivery of it wasn't that great, but hey, who doesn't love that line? It's still one of the funniest lines ever written, in my opinion. Plus, who doesn't love Tom Wilson's just the teeniest bit over-the-top acting as Biff Tannen? And of course, eventually he plays his grandfather, Buford Mad Dog Tannen. Yeah. His over-the-top acting, though, is perfect for the character and perfect for the fact that, in my opinion, these movies are meant to be comedies as well as sci-fi movies. You know, they're not just one or the other, they're both. And that's why they work so well, in my opinion, because you can't truly understand a time travel story, I feel, if you can't relate to the humanity of it. And a lot of times, some of the best human moments come through comedy. So, now let's look at Back to the Future Part 2. An interesting thing to note is that they could not get Crispin Glover back for Back to the Future Part 2, which is why whenever you see Crispin Glover's character George McFly in this film, he's upside down on that new age sort of walker gizmo, or he's dead, as in the case of when they go to the alternate 1985, or he's used from clips from the first film. Now, it's interesting to note that even though they had such primitive technologies at the time, they were able to somewhat, at least for the most part, go seamlessly into the first film for some of those alternate 1980 or for some of those 1955 sequences. Now, I want you to think about this. That second film, actually, believe it or not, gets a bad rep online because a lot of fans' initial reactions to it was, I thought this was a standalone movie like the first film was. But in reality, they had already shot Back to the Future 3 and were working on the post-production process on it when Back to the Future 2 was released in theaters. Back to the Future 2 was never meant to be a standalone movie, but fans felt like they had gotten gypped when it turned out that it was not a standalone movie. But I think one of the smartest moves Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis did in Back to the Future Part 2 was they put a trailer for Back to the Future 3 at the end of it to entice people to come back the next year to go on the final adventure with Doc and Marty, set in the Old West. One of the things that's so great and classic about Back to the Future 3 is that bar scene between Buford Mad Dog Tannen and Marty when he tells him his name is Eastwood, Clint Eastwood. Little known fact, when Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis asked Clint Eastwood if they could use his name, he was honored by the fact that they were doing an homage to his westerns. I always felt that was kind of interesting because while I don't know a whole lot about Clint Eastwood, you have to admit it's pretty cool when the actor feels honored that they're paying a tribute to him in another film. Another interesting thing about Back to the Future Part 3 is that it was the first film to use the Universal Studios 75th anniversary logo. This year, Universal celebrates its 100th anniversary. Hard to believe it's been 25 years. That being said, I've somewhat mixed in my trivia this week with the films section. But you have to admit, Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox's performance in all three of these films were perfect, weren't they? Doc and Marty's relationship is one of the best screen relationships between two characters I believe I've ever encountered. Now, the thing that I always found interesting, though, was that even though Doc and Marty have this great on-screen relationship, no one ever thinks to really talk about Biff Tannen, Tom Wilson, or Marty's mother, Lorraine McFly, as played by Leah Thompson. Both great actors, both did beautiful jobs in this film. So, two other little pieces of trivia before we move on to our drink for the week. Gremlins, another Amblin Entertainment film produced by Steven Spielberg, much like Back to the Future was produced by Steven Spielberg, shot on the exact same backlot as Back to the Future Part 1. Warner Brothers backlot, to be exact. Now, isn't that interesting? Because it had never occurred to me until I heard it in the commentary to Gremlins, actually, that they were the same backlot. But in looking at it now, I can't help but see the similarities. Makes it kind of interesting that Kingston Fall, home of Billy Peltzer and the Gremlins, is also Hill Valley, California. And for one film, they covered the backlot in snow, and for another film, no snow. Interesting. At least it is to me. Another interesting thing is, if you pay attention to the businesses in Back to the Future 3, you'll note similarities between some of the other time periods, where there was a car lot with the last name Jones. There's a horse dealership in Back to the Future 3 with the last name Jones. That's the end of our trivia and movie sections for the week. Now, let's look at that drink. 1.21 gigawatts! 1.21 gigawatts! Great Scott! Sorry, couldn't help myself. When you're talking about the Back to the Future trilogy, it's hard not to impersonate Doc Brown at least a little bit. In honor of Doc Brown's DeLorean, Tonight we're going to be making a 1.21 gigawatts. For this drink, you're going to need vanilla vodka, blue curacao, and pineapple juice. We fill a tall glass with ice. Then we're going to take our vanilla vodka, followed by our blue curacao, vodka in honor of Lorraine McFly, blue curacao in honor of the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, pineapple juice for something tropical, but we need a little something extra to generate the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity Doc Brown needs to power his DeLorean. Plutonium, or as I like to call it, 151 rum. We light the shot, and add to drink, blow off to make sure it's not lit, and consume. From all of us here at Movies at the Tiki Bar, please drink responsibly and enjoy the Back to the Future trilogy. P.S. If you get a hangover from this, just make you some wake-up juice. You'll be as sober as a priest on Sunday.